Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the panel. We'll be starting in the next few moments. Can I please ask before we start, if everyone can please select either English or French for whichever language they would prefer to listen to, and we'll give everyone about 10 or 15 seconds to select that now. Great, thank you very much. And thank you again for joining us for this event. We will be starting in the next minute or two, but just before the event, we would like to play a brief video which is related to the theme of this event. And we're going to play that now before handing over to Christine Stegling from Frontline AIDS, who will open the discussion. And here is the video.
So I hope we are on.
Yes, we can hear you, Chrissy.
Yeah, we can't see ourselves, but that might be something to do with us. But welcome everybody to this event. I'm not sure if we are okay and we're on, Olin. Can you see us?
Yes, Chrissy, we can see you and can hear you very clearly. And
we can't see ourselves, but okay, fine. My name is Christine Stegling. Welcome to this event. I'm really pleased to welcome you all. I'm the Executive Director of Frontline AIDS. The reason why we played this video is because we thought it really captured the essence of why we're here today. We can't overemphasize how much in danger we are of losing track on the many, many successes we've had over the last 30 years, really, responding to HIV and AIDS. And as this short film from the Global Fund showed us, and as the report that the Global Fund released yesterday showed us, it is really disheartening to see that what many of us have been warning about for the last 18 months or so has actually, it is actually seen in the report. We are moving backwards. There is a real danger and now evidence that progress that we have made on many of the targets on HIV and AIDS is really stalling and actually going backwards. And what the report from the Global Fund shows us that while we have been we continue to increase access to antiretroviral therapy, where we are seeing alarming declines are on HIV prevention, on HIV testing, and that should really give all of us really reason to be worried about the future of the response to AIDS. And alongside what I would call a crisis in the service delivery at the national level, community level, we also know that there is a funding crisis on its way. Here at Frontline AIDS, we were very much impacted by the recent cuts by the UK government earlier in the year through UK aid. We were forced to close 2 programs working with marginalized populations in several countries, actually. And we continue to be very concerned about the UK government support to both UNAIDS, but also to the Global Fund. We are aware that several other donors have recently taken the decision to reduce funding to HIV. And it is really frightening to think about the impact that these decisions will have on people living with and affected by HIV, especially at this moment where there's 2 or several colliding pandemics. Yet, as we also saw in the video, there's another side to the story, and that's the story of incredible leadership by communities most affected by HIV and by community-based organizations that have shown this year, as they have shown when they responded to the AIDS pandemic, that they have the extraordinary capacity to innovate and to sustain access to life-saving HIV services, to protect their communities from COVID-19, and for tackling the many challenging impacts of lockdowns, the human rights violations, the food shortages, the rise in gender-based violence, and the rise in teenage pregnancy. The UNAIDS strategy recognizes the vital role of communities responding to HIV and the unique experience and expertise that our movement, the HIV movement, could bring to wider pandemic preparedness. And from what we see with the Global Funds, the draft Global Fund strategy, the Global Fund seems to be following suit. But the reason why we're here today is to ask ourselves the question, what about the rest of the global health architecture? Have we succeeded in making our points to WHO, to ACTA, and the growing number of other key players thinking about the future of pandemic responses, or have we failed? Is HIV even on their minds at this moment in time? And what about national governments? Are they thinking about building on the structures that we have developed over 4 decades of responding to HIV, or have they forgotten about those? As the HIV movement, we urgently need to reach out beyond our usual spaces, beyond talking to each other and in echo chambers, and ensure that the people who are making decisions right now about the future of pandemic preparedness can hear our voices. That is why we have organized today's event, to give ourselves a chance to strategize how we can ensure the strongest possible voice for the HIV movement and how we convince our governments, donors, and international actors like WHO of the unique expertise that HIV organizations can bring to the fight against pandemics, both current and in the future in the years to come. So I feel this great sense of urgency that we do our best to ensure that our voice is unified, loud, and not ignored, which is why I think our discussion here today is of such importance. So now, as we move into answering these important questions, let me introduce you to my co-chair, Anne Aslett. Anne is a friend and supporter of Frontline AIDS for many years. She's also the executive director of the Elton AIDS Foundation and has been with the foundation for almost 20 years. EJAV is a valued partner of Frontline AIDS and recently worked with us to write to Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, to urge him and other leaders at the G7 summit in the summer to build on what we have achieved in the fight to end AIDS. I'm very happy to have you here, Anne, and in our office, which is very exciting. Thank you. Alongside Anne, I would like to introduce you to our 3 panelists. Let me start with Cindy Kelemi. Cindy is calling in from Botswana. Cindy is the executive director of our partner in Botswana, the Botswana Network on Ethics, Law, and HIV/AIDS, which I have some affiliation with in the past. Cindy is an amazing activist who has impacted the response to HIV in Botswana, but also regionally and increasingly internationally. And she's now spearheading the civil society efforts to ensure that there's effective access to a COVID vaccine in Botswana. And an effective response to COVID overall. I'm warmly welcoming you, Cindy, and I'm looking forward to hearing your reflections as part of the discussion. Also dialing in, but from South Africa, neighboring Botswana, is my friend and colleague, Lois Chingandu, who is the Director of Evidence and Influence here at Frontline AIDS. Lois also represents us in the global campaign for a people vaccine. Lois is a long-standing activist who started working on HIV in the 1980s and has experienced the different waves of the HIV response. Before there was treatment, with treatment, and now with COVID-19. Welcome, Lois. And finally, I'm super delighted to introduce you to our third panelist, the Executive Director of UNAIDS, Ms. Winnie Byanyima. And even more excited that Winnie is actually here in person and we're sitting real life next to each other in our office here in Brighton. Winnie is a passionate and long-standing champion of social justice and gender equality. And Winnie was an early champion of a people vaccine for COVID and has overseen the development of a new global AIDS strategy, which we are all very excited about. A strategy that is underpinned by a deep commitment to equality, human rights, and the leadership of communities most affected by HIV. Welcome, Winnie.
Thank you.
So let's move into the discussions. I will start with Winnie, and I want to ask you, Winnie, with the new global AIDS strategy and it being very clear about the need to ensure that HIV remains a priority for health systems and financing. In the discussions around pandemic preparedness, how much of a priority do you feel HIV is currently? And what are the threats to the HIV response if we continue on the trajectory that we are on currently?
Thank you. Thank you, Christine and Anne. And I'm so delighted to be here at your offices, finally. And welcome to the listeners who are here with us. Yes. And first of all, thank you for the great video. I think it really set the context in which we are in. It communicates powerfully. Today, there are discussions beginning at the United Nations on pandemic preparedness, on global health security. There is something about a pandemics treaty that's being discussed and reforms of the global health architecture as a result of this pandemic, COVID. But my concern is, will the right lessons have been learned in reshaping the global health architecture and ensuring that we are prepared for the next pandemic? There will be other pandemics to come. Have we learned everything from the HIV response that has been very successful, I must say, that has brought 27, almost 28 million people onto treatment, living good lives, but still has a long way to reach the end, 2030 as we hope. What about the lessons from that? Are they being taken into account? And are we going to be able to fight and end HIV and fight and end COVID and be ready for the next one? This is the important question that you have asked. We can. We have our new global AIDS strategy. We said we will end inequalities to end AIDS. We must tackle those inequalities that still make some people vulnerable, such that they are not able to access what we have for prevention and for treatment. So now, the question is, what are those inequalities and how have we been able to close them for so many others and not for others? These are the important questions that we want to see addressed, because we can't end one pandemic and not end another. We can't make one pandemic, the fighting one pandemic shouldn't cost us the struggle against another or other diseases. That's why I'm here in the UK. I have met with civil society. I have met with parliamentarians. I have met with people living with HIV, and I've met the ministers in this country, Secretary of State for Health, the Secretary for International Development, to make the point, one, that AIDS isn't over. Indeed, certain inequalities keep people away from getting newly infected or coming onto treatment and staying on. Last year alone, there were 1.5 million people around the world who were newly infected, and almost 700,000 who died of AIDS-related illnesses. An AIDS death every minute constitutes an emergency. That's the point I was making. We were already off track to end AIDS before COVID hit us. And now, as the video showed, the fight has become even tougher and we are losing ground. The impact can be seen through the disruptions in service delivery. The impact can be seen in the lockdowns. So I keep saying that the cost hasn't been counted because the knock-on effect of the lockdowns, of the harsher use of criminal laws in the fight against COVID are costing us so much that is still not counted. The people who are starving, the people who have lost incomes, the people who are dying of other illnesses because the health systems have been stretched and can't deliver. I was recently on a virtual mission to the Philippines. These days I do my missions on the screen. And by the way, it would be nice to see some images here. We just see a black screen. I learned that in the Philippines, there's been a decrease in HIV testing of 61% from last year. 61% HIV testing from the difference between last year and this year. And during the same time, enrollment for HIV treatment dropped by almost 30%. And these are figures across the developing world. We have to ensure that our HIV movement, what we have won, what we have learned, is definitely part of these discussions about ending the pandemics of today and being prepared for the next. So what are those lessons that we learned from fighting HIV? And I keep saying it's been a success story. Even though we have not come to the end, there's so much we have learned to get us to this point. First, as we have put in our strategy, you have to confront the inequalities that drive a pandemic head on. The idea that some people are more vulnerable may be intrinsically because they are born like that, or they are like that, or their behavior is wrong. The truth is that they face inequalities, and it is these inequalities that drive it. So using that lens is important. We have that now in our political declaration that heads of state made. I will come back to that. Secondly, so what are those inequalities? Access to health technologies and innovations. We know that prolongs pandemics, but that's a lesson that's not being learned today. We learned this from HIV, from a very painful experience when life-saving antiretrovirals were available far earlier here in the rich north, but yet some 9 million lives were lost in the developing countries because of the high cost of those treatments. We learned that, so why repeat it now? That's why you see here in the UK, I think up to 80% of people over 16 are now fully vaccinated. We're talking of a third round for those who are vulnerable. And that's good, we have nothing against that. But the number in the developing countries and in low income countries, in Africa, for example, is less than 2%, 2% of the population. So what does this mean? It means that for the developing countries, the fight against COVID is more severe. People are still dying. Lockdowns are still in place. And new variants are being created that still will come back to haunt those who have received vaccinations here. So it's self-defeating. Access to health technologies and innovations we learned must be for everyone in order to reach the end of a pandemic. That's a lesson to learn, to put in the new treaty, to put in the strategy for pandemic preparedness of the future. We are not there yet. I'm proud that Frontline AIDS and UNAIDS are members of the People's Vaccine Alliance. And Christine, I have to salute your leadership here. At a time, because we sounded this out well before even a vaccine was found. Because we could see from the HIV experience that you can have the vaccine, but unless it can reach everybody, we won't end the pandemic. We knew that from the HIV experience. When we started saying it, there were many skeptics, including in the UN, in the HIV movement itself. Many people thought we are leaving our own agenda to fight another agenda, not realizing just that these two pandemics are going to collide and devastate those who are vulnerable even more. So I thank you, Christine, for your leadership and bringing the HIV movement behind this issue. And we still have a fight, because if we don't fight for more innovations to close inequalities for people suffering, people with HIV, living with HIV and who may be infected, and also for COVID, we won't win. The third lesson is that communities must be at the center. We know this again from real experience here in this country. I've been to a community, the food chain. I saw the work that they are doing. I saw how they are tackling the loneliness that people living with HIV face, the rejection. Stigma is still strong, even in this country that's been so successful. I met people who have no families to connect with, but who find community in the food chain, get not just food, but affirmation, dignity. So communities at the center of fighting a pandemic is critical. And that levels the ground for people, reduces inequalities. So that must be in this. Again, when I talk to the governments, we are getting a seat at the table in these discussions as UNAIDS, and these are the issues we advance. But when I make this point, I hear a silence in the room, and then they move on to another issue to do with infrastructure, to do with regulations, to do with the fact that people must be at the center seems peripheral. We have to put it at the center. The fourth point is a rights-based approach. We know this, that fighting a pandemic is about asserting the rights of everybody, equality, human rights. Again, they miss the point. The governments often miss the point. They look at, as I said, infrastructure. They look at regulations, borders, and so on. They don't look at this as an issue of closing the rights gaps. The people who, the pandemic moves, every pandemic moves along those cracks. It is transmitted by those who don't enjoy equal rights to access services, to their place in society. And until we close those rights gaps, we don't end a pandemic. We know this from HIV. So closing that human rights gap, making human rights central in fighting a pandemic is another issue we carry into this. And finally, financing, you touched it, financing for health. Health systems today are about, and this is what is being sold even by us in the UN, unfortunately. This assumption that you can sell health the way you sell my handbag here, like a commodity, and that way you will achieve the right to health for all. That's false, and we have to fight that. We have to insist that health systems must be publicly financed. And those who have money and can buy extras for themselves. But all people have a right to receive healthcare that's publicly financed from people's taxes. This you have here in this country in the national health system. this is not what we are pushing. We're talking of universal health coverage, but we are saying crowd in private sector money, crowd in the people who are seeking a profit. Hey, there's a contradiction there. So we have to push hard for financing health and financing pandemics through public financing so that everybody is reached. Again, that's a lesson from our HIV. The fact that today, someone in a poor country like Uganda, where I come from, is receiving the same antiretrovirals as someone in a rich country here. That was what was won by you who have been fighting in this movement. That equal right to the same health care. And that is what we must also put there. So I want to stop there, talked a lot. But lastly, it's about global solidarity. And we're not going to end a global health crisis by taking nationalistic approaches. That it is by pooling resources together, political will together, and fighting together that we can win. That's why we are here with HIV. Having made this progress, it came from global solidarity, a global plan with global resources, plowed in by those who have the means, the richer countries, supporting developing countries to end a pandemic. We need that. Okay, I said Christine.
Thank you, Winnie.
Too much talk.
And all very, very good points. I want to get back to where I left it a little bit, and you touched on it. So we have the lessons learned. We know what worked. We know global solidarity is the answer. But what we are seeing, you have often talked about, is apartheid. We're seeing, as you have described, a real separation of those who have access and those who don't. And in my view, there is really a humanitarian or a crisis developing that people are just looking the other way. Those who have are looking the other way. So my question is, knowing the lessons, knowing what works, but you have already said when you sit in those spaces, people often start looking the other way and they start talking about infrastructure. They're not talking about inequality. They're not talking about those lessons learned from HIV. What is UNAIDS doing currently to ensure that the HIV response is firmly positioned in these discussions and is not just touched on, but not really taken into consideration as we are planning for a pandemic, for pandemic preparedness or pandemic response that takes on those lessons on board, but that also anchors HIV in the middle of that? Is there more that you as UNAIDS can do, or that we as a movement can do to change, to alter the course that we are on right now? A few thoughts, maybe 3 minutes, so we can hear from our other panelists.
I will do shorter now. It's a great question. We as UNAIDS, we see ourselves as part of the global HIV movement. We are together in this. We all have our different roles. As UNAIDS, as part of the UN system, we are tiny. We are small compared, say, to WHO and others. But we fight and fight and fight to have a seat at the table so that we can bring these issues in the governmental discussions. That's one thing. Two, we've been doing very much to highlight these lessons learned. Mm-hmm. For example, we are there in the countries fighting, defending human rights, and we published. Mm-hmm. We published, for example, a report on human rights in the context of pandemics in the early phases when the public health orders were using excessive force and not taking into account the needs of people living with HIV. So we showed the impacts. We got angry governments, they never like being shown their human rights gaps, but we made the point. So doing more, all of us, to highlight the human rights issues within this context, showing how people living with HIV, for example, are more prone to serious illness when they catch COVID. So putting all this out and showing how the public orders are affecting key populations, for example, people in shelters in our countries who are running away from criminal laws. being attacked and being accused of spreading COVID because there are so many huddled in one space. We must put these things out. So those are some of the things we need to do. We also, of course, must organize again as people, as an HIV movement, to challenge the inequalities that are common to all to the two. So these are some of the things to re-energize our movement, to assert the rights of key populations, the human rights, to connect the issues of women and girls in the context of pandemics. These are some of the things we need to do.
Great, thank you. I'll hand over to Anne. I do want to leave something on the table that we might come back to, is whether or not, as we reorganize ourselves as a movement and enter these new spaces, whether we need to think of using different language. Is it that we're not being heard because we're speaking a language that people say is the right thing, but isn't what makes them behave differently in terms of decision makers? But maybe we'll get back to that a little bit later.
But can I just add that I was so impressed by this civil society here in the UK, how you stood up and raised your voice against the cuts. That was the sort of action we need to do. That in the middle of a global health crisis, this government that has led the world to fight HIV is now pulling out on those who are most vulnerable. You stood up. These are the things.
Thanks, Winnie. Over to you, Anne.
Thanks, Chrissy. So I'd like to turn to Cindy in Botswana. Cindy, some of the issues that Winnie's touched on, these global discussions about preparing for future pandemics, how does this actually compare with what's taking place in Botswana itself? Because obviously Botswana was one of the countries most severely hit by the AIDS pandemic. And following that experience, how effective do you feel that the government has been in responding to this latest pandemic, to COVID-19?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just to appreciate the opportunity to be here at this very important discussion. And may I kindly send a special hello to Madam Winnie Byanyima, who is the Executive Director of UNAIDS, as well as Christine Stegling, Director of Frontline AIDS. As BONELA, we are pleased to have this opportunity to share lessons from BONELA. From Botswana, I beg your pardon. As you rightfully pointed out, Botswana is known as a country that played a leading role in terms of responding to the HIV/AIDS pandemic. But unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the COVID-19 response. And primarily because of some of the reasons that have already been shared by Madam Winnie. One of the things that we saw that really saddened us as a sector is the fact that we saw an approach that was purely biomedical at the exclusion of communities. As civil society, as other community structures on the ground, there was really willingness and preparedness to support the government in terms of addressing COVID-19, but that space was not available. So it will really sadden us if going forward and in the context of pandemic preparedness, we talk about it at the exclusion of communities. I think you have seen both in terms of the numbers of infections that we had as a country, the number of deaths as well, and also the impact on the healthcare system. We had a healthcare system that was totally overwhelmed and indicative of lack of capacity to deal with the epidemic. So if we continue with this trajectory where we exclude communities, we are likely to see, even with future epidemics, where we are unable to effectively deal with them in the way that we were able to deal with HIV and AIDS. The other challenge that we also saw was coordination or lack of coordination. As a country, we created the Presidential Task Force, which was tasked with providing strategic oversight for the response to COVID-19. However, in terms of now implementation, we saw that the Ministry of Health was quite excluded from the process to a greater extent. That created problems for us as civil society, particularly where we wanted to effectively participate and engage in the response. We could see that there are two centers of power, and we struggled really to communicate and also to ensure that the lessons, or at least evidence from the communities, is put forward and used to guide programming. These are lessons that are already available through HIV/AIDS, where we created, for instance, the National AIDS Council, which basically provided space for all actors in the response to be able to contribute at a policy level. At a local level, we had, we have district multisectoral committees, which were responsible for implementation, or which are responsible for implementation at subnational level. So in the absence of such structures in responding to COVID-19, it became apparent that most stakeholders who could have had a really strong impact could not do so because of lack of coordination. The other challenge that we also saw was leadership. I think we went on the highest record of turnover within the Ministry of Health, from the level of minister to the level of permanent secretaries and director of public health services. That created problems in terms of consistency. One of the lessons that we learned from HIV was that consistency and continuity is very important, so that our messages can reach the right people at the right time, and they can also relate and resonate with those messages. We also struggled very much with access to information. And this is a problem that preceded the COVID-19 situation. So it goes to tell us that for us to be able to effectively deliver on our programs, be it HIV, TB, COVID-19, we really need to ensure that civil society is working within a space where access to information is a reality. In our context, it was not a reality, and it was difficult to get any information, whether it's about procurement, whether it's about who is most affected and where are they, whether it's about how do I get involved. It was very difficult, and it still is. The other problem was general lack of preparedness. I think as countries in the West were busy talking about vaccines, the African voice was not present. Our own government, we later learned that in terms of, putting up our requests or our orders for vaccines, it took us, we did that very late on in the process. So that is why access became such a challenge for us in terms of vaccines. We also worked in a very, or we still do work in a very difficult legal environment where we are operating under the state of public emergency. And that in itself limits our ability to effectively participate in the response because of the existing laws which are aimed at curbing COVID-19. Governance also becomes a major challenge, especially if we are operating under the state of public emergency. We also saw, human rights challenges emerging as a result of COVID-19. So we as an organization have and continue to respond to some of those challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. It's a long list. How tragic that the lessons from Botswana's AIDS epidemic haven't informed the response to COVID. And I think unpreparedness and lack of leadership is something that we recognize across the world in the last 18 months. You mentioned the work of BONELA, and I'd love if you could share a little bit in the context of these challenges, and you talk about communities and how important they are. what role have organizations like yours, like BONELA, played in Botswana's COVID-19 response? And what special expertise and experience do you think the HIV movement is able to bring, particularly at a non-governmental community level, whether to COVID-19 or to other pandemics?
Thank you very much for the question. We as an organization, our experience and track record really has been around advocacy, advocating for an enabling policy and legal environment. And we have been very successful in the past in terms of, being or creating precedents around certain policies and laws. So in the context of COVID-19, we continued doing that. Speaking truth to power, this becomes critical, especially in an environment where there is restriction in terms of what civil society and other partners and stakeholders can do. So part of our role was to bring evidence from the ground. And we realized that that is something that was lacking, so that we can begin to program from an evidence-based perspective. Our role was also to ensure that we bring along communities and that there is national dialogue around COVID-19. We ensured that the messages are communicated, and we ensured that there is dialogue within the public space. We also ensured that we bring in the human rights element, which is critical if we are to reach everyone, especially those who are marginalized and vulnerable. We also contributed quite a lot to the provision of services, especially during lockdowns where movement was restricted. We realized that there were services which were really impacted by COVID-19, especially when we look at access to commodities such as condoms and lubricants. Because of cross-border issues, those commodities could not come into the country. And as such, we had a huge public outcry due to stockouts. So one of the innovations that we did was to ensure that we facilitate distribution of condoms in very strategic places. For instance, your supermarkets, we have what we call tuck shops here. We ensured that condoms are available there, and that we engage our clients through online platforms so that they can be able to access such commodities. The other thing that we did, and we continue to do, which is critical, is to remind government and other players that there are other epidemics that still exist. So for us to focus only on COVID-19 at the expense of other epidemics, we are basically losing on the gains that we have achieved over the years, whether you are talking TB, whether you are talking malaria, and of course other diseases. So our role was to constantly remind government that we still have other epidemics and we have to deal with those. We also provided legal aid. It was apparent that through the lockdown, there were cases that were coming to us in relation, for instance, to police brutality in an effort to ensure that people comply with COVID-19 related regulations. So we were addressing those over and above other cases that were reaching us. We also ensured that there is access to psychosocial support services. We realized that mental health is also another epidemic, which of course pre-existed before COVID, but it is clear that COVID-19 also exacerbated the situation. So our role was to ensure that people have access to such services. There was also a problem of linking clients or people to social services. We know that as people were put on lockdowns and as people continue to lose jobs as a result of COVID-19, they continue to need social services and social safety nets. So our role was also to ensure that those who needed such services are available to them. So we continue to do this work. We strongly believe that it is important. However, we need to do more in terms of creating space for civil society to effectively engage. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you for the extraordinary work that you do, for seeing the people behind the biomedical response and for actually responding in a realistic and practical and compassionate way. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand back to Chrissy.
Thank you. I want to move to Lois now. Lois, we've heard from Cindy about the way that HIV organizations have stepped into the fight against COVID-19. And yet, as we discussed earlier, our voices and our concerns are missing when it comes to the big conversations about pandemic preparedness. How do you think the HIV movement needs to evolve to fully position itself to engage in pandemic preparedness in a way that continues to position HIV as a global priority? So doing both at the same time, very closely linked to the question that we discussed earlier with Winnie.
Thank you very much, Chrissy. And I would like to echo Cindy's sentiments in welcoming Madam Winnie to Frontline AIDS offices in Brighton. It's really an exciting day today. But to just get back to your question, I think the Global Fund video, just the video that we watched at the beginning of this conversation, clearly is showing us that HIV has been impacted by COVID. We have lost ground. This is what Global Fund says. And as the HIV movements, we are compelled to really take these results very seriously and to quickly mobilize ourselves to join in the advocacy, not just to end AIDS, but also to end COVID and for the world to prepare itself for future pandemics. In order for us to do this well, we need to adapt ourselves as the HIV movement. Our successes as an HIV movement and the results that we achieved are well recognized the world over. And yet we have delayed using that experience to advocate to end COVID, which is now hindering us from ending AIDS. But I think the question to ask ourselves is, how do we adapt? How do we fit with the groups that we feel do not know us, nor do they understand our language, what I call the HIV speak? When we talk of communities, for example, and I think Madam Winnie also referenced to this, we are often misunderstood. Some people think we are talking about community caregivers, and people find it difficult to understand when we are talking about putting communities at the center. So how do we adapt in a context in which we are no longer making the key decisions, and yet HIV is so much under threat from COVID and future pandemics? And yet we still need to adapt, because if we don't adapt, people will continue to die in many of the countries where we sit. We need to prepare ourselves to fit into intersectionality spaces, where on one hand, we can keep HIV on the agenda as the pandemic of now, and at the same time calling for the end of COVID, which has become a threat to the HIV response. And I think it's very important that we understand this coexistence of the two pandemics, and how now one pandemic is definitely now hindering our ability to fight the HIV pandemic. But unfortunately, those intersectionality spaces don't necessarily exist today. What exists are parallel spaces of the HIV movement, and now what we have as the COVID movement, which is primarily the vaccine movement. They are not necessarily speaking to each other, and they are not necessarily drawing on each other's experiences and capacities which would actually make us really much stronger. There are a few things that I would like to propose that we do quite urgently. The first thing is we need to build a bridge between the two pandemics through an intersectionality lens. Secondly, we need to seek mutual partnerships with new players and not the usual friends that we are used to talking to when we were advocating for HIV. And we also need to develop this intersectionality language that advocates for ending AIDS and ending COVID and prepare the world for future pandemics in a way that is understood by our newfound partners. And I think that's going to be our biggest challenge. What is this language that we need to use? We've both been referencing to how we are often either ignored or not understood. And until we change our own language, we will continue to be misunderstood. We just can't walk into those spaces and use the same language that we used with HIV. An important umbrella to think of our adaptation process is what we have used at Frontline AIDS, which is really about sustaining the gains that we made in HIV, but adapting to addressing the new needs that have emerged and the new threats that have emerged. And most importantly, within that context, continue to protect human rights, which is quite critical. The Global Fund video we saw today is a call to action. We cannot go back there. We can only go forward. But we can only do that if we start organizing now to go into these new spaces. It's not going to happen when we are sitting alone in our own spaces. We have to go into the spaces. We have to build that bridge that I'm talking about. And Frontline AIDS has started thinking and doing work around this process. And at the end of this meeting, we will send you invitations to join our campaign group where we will be working. We would like to work together with many of you to adapt our HIV movement to work within a pandemic preparedness response, because the movement is facing a significant threat at the moment. But I believe if we really move into that space, we will continue to show our relevance and we can make a difference. Thank you.
Thanks, Lois. And I think you have already touched on it, but it would be good to hear, you're referencing the fact that we are being ignored, or we are talking to the wrong people, or we have just not adapted to this new situation. So you're talking about, let's move into new spaces. So maybe just say a little bit more about what are those spaces? Where are they and what are they? And where are the opportunities for the HIV movement to engage? And that might be at national, regional, but also at global level.
Yes. So there are several opportunities, but the biggest opportunity that is sitting and working right now is the People's Vaccine Alliance. And this is an example of a good process, but it is still a parallel process because it is taking place outside the HIV movement. So we still have the HIV movement sitting outside. In that platform, Frontline AIDS, we do sit in the People's Vaccine, but we need a much bigger HIV voice within that space. And that's what we need to work on. There is space for the HIV movement to get on board and fight side by side to end both pandemics. And I'll just quickly show this slide to show you where some of the opportunities are sitting. Thank you. So if you look at this slide is about vaccine equity. And in my mind, this is the key to pandemic preparedness. We cannot talk pandemic preparedness outside us having equal vaccine access to everybody. And there are opportunities in the 3 blue boxes that you see there. There is the production level, which is where the People's Vaccine Alliance is mainly targeting. The global advocacy that is taking place is mainly targeting the production and ensuring that we have adequate and we address the TRIPS flexibilities, and we address the patents wars. But if you then look from the time that the vaccines have been produced and they are being exported to the countries, there are still issues, there are huge issues of inequality, which Madam Winnie consistently talks about in the vaccine apartheid you were talking about. But when you take that again and you move to the last stage, which is distribution in country, there is lots of the issues that again we can intervene at the regional and national level with our advocates. All these are opportunities that are existing. As you can see, that there are challenges even at in-country distribution, and there are challenges at exportation. So if we work together, the People's Vaccine Alliance and the organizations that are sitting in country, and many of the HIV movements, that's where they are sitting, and they can really work on addressing issues of in-country distribution, and then we can have a complete cycle. And we can't work on this in a vacuum or in parallel structures. We need to talk to each other. We need to work together. Thank you.
Thanks, Lois. I'll hand over back to Anne to go back to all three of our panelists. Thank you.
Sure. So, and thank you so much for that, Lois. That's incredibly helpful. As the HIV movement, whether that's foundations or civil society organizations, UNAIDS, or people in communities most affected by HIV, what do we think are some of the things that we really need to do urgently in the coming weeks and months? You've laid out some very, very clear imperatives around the people's vaccine and vaccine preparedness. But can I ask, are there other things that you think are incredibly important for us to be focusing on in the weeks and months ahead? First, yes. To Lois, thanks.
Yes, thank you. The other opportunities that I can just quickly mention, the Global Fund report that has just come out is a huge opportunity for us. It is clearly acknowledging the fact that we are in a crisis, and there is a huge opportunity for the HIV movement to ride on this crisis and use this evidence to push forward the agenda of refocusing on HIV. The UNAIDS strategy is another opportunity which provides us with it's calling for us to fight for equality in the response to HIV. And we can take that fight for equality to also encompass the COVID response. Another important area is the civil society voice within what is called the Act A, which is the Access to COVID Technologies Accelerator. And this is work that Frontline AIDS has already started working with others like Stop AIDS, GFAN, and Waki Health to support and convene civil society representative within the different ACT pillars. You will notice when I presented that slide, within that ACT pillars, there are also real issues that we need to advocate for. The delays that happens to even get vaccines to countries, some of them are sitting in those three pillars. And lastly, we have this new global pandemic treaty, which is being championed by WHO. It is vital that we, as a movement, we put pressure on WHO in order to ensure that we have access to the process and that the civil society voice in that process is loud and clear. Otherwise, again, it's going to focus on the infrastructure and all these other things, and the communities will be left behind. Thanks.
Thank you. And can I turn also to Cindy and ask the same question? You laid out a huge amount of challenges in the response in Botswana. What do you think are the things that we need to be doing now in the coming weeks and months as a movement in terms of shared action to really make our voice heard and to really be relevant in this discussion about epidemic preparedness?
Thank you very much, Chair, for the question. I think, first of all, from a country perspective, we strongly believe that we should be at the table where decisions are made. That is critical for us as a movement. It's also critical for the communities that we represent. So we would want to see a coordinated mechanism through which we can be at the table. We will also depend on leadership at UNAIDS level to really lead this new path we are going into. As a civil society representative from at a country level, I have quite a lot of questions and fears about what this means for the work that we have been doing. So ensuring that we really galvanize and coordinate and mobilize to effectively use these spaces becomes really, really critical. We also want to see a situation where we can boldly share lessons from the HIV movement. I think we undersell ourselves because we do not necessarily package what we are trying to communicate. Hence, people would not listen to us or ignore us. I think at this particular time, it is becoming even more urgent that we be heard. So we can only be heard if we package our information to the extent that even those we are to work with are able to understand what we are talking about. We also want to see a situation where civil society, there is preparedness within the movement as well. And that includes capacity building. What is pandemic preparedness? When we are talking about a pandemic preparedness treaty, what is it? That information needs to reach even our grassroots level organizations so that they can even begin to position at national level to identify those spaces that can facilitate engagement around pandemic preparedness and pandemic preparedness treaties. There is so much that we can share. As I said, we need to share boldly. I mean, there's so much that we have achieved as a movement. Issues that I've already highlighted, for instance, around coordination, community leadership, community-based infrastructure for health. And more often than not, when we talk about community-based infrastructure for health, there is a misunderstanding, at least from our perspective, that we are not only talking about health facilities. We are talking about even structures within communities that can facilitate access to health. It was really interesting to see when COVID-19 started, especially in the context of Botswana, where we started looking for places to use as isolation centers, and people were put in hotels, and that became unsustainable. Yet we have facilities within the communities that could have provided such a service. So for us, that should also be a priority. Again, I cannot overemphasize the importance of rights-based responses. Even in the pandemic preparedness agenda, as well as the treaty itself, we ought to ensure that a rights-based approach to access to services becomes a priority. Speakers before me have already talked about the UNAIDS global strategy, which really identifies some of the underlying issues that inhibit access to services, access to health services, ending inequalities, gender equality, addressing stigma and discrimination. That also needs to be prioritized. And I've already also spoken to engagement and participation of vulnerable and marginalized communities. That is also key. The other thing that I think we need as a paradigm shift is really to approach our work from from a perspective of integration, I think for the longest time, we have been talking about integration, but that agenda is not moving as fast as it should. So in this time when we are talking about pandemic preparedness and a response to pandemics, an integrated approach then becomes really critical, because we know if we use an integrated approach, then we are going to be cost effective in our work. And also we know that is a holistic approach. The other area that we also have to look into and derive lessons that can take us forward is universal health coverage. What have we been able to achieve here? How can we use this approach as well going forward so that we locate and create space for ourselves within pandemic preparedness? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now can I turn to you, Winnie? What in the coming weeks and months is really front of mind for you about what we need to do?
Three big things. It's very urgent, of course, that we get the vaccine to everyone who needs it in every country. This is critical. To get out of this crisis, there is a vaccine that can get us all out, and we need to get it to everyone. So right now, we must make those countries that have excess doses and are hoarding to share those doses, pressure on them, share the doses, pressure to increase production by licensing more companies across different continents to produce more doses. So, but that, of course, requires also the TRIPS waiver, because that is rights to be able to manufacture without being sued for stealing intellectual property. So the TRIPS waiver, to get support for it from a country like UK, which is still resisting, European Union, Germany, but the momentum is there. So pushing hard. But within that, to remember that what is key is not just to make a breakthrough for a vaccine today, but to actually change the rules of access to medicines for the future. This is critical. Because even today, one of the reasons we are not making all the progress we want on HIV is that some of the treatments which we could have, some of the innovations that we could have that would move us there aren't available because of these unfair trade rules on access to medicines. For example, TB is the biggest killer for people living with HIV. But TB is still being treated with the most old-fashioned treatments that exist. Newer treatments could be there, but it's all to do with a system of producing medicines that's driven just by profits. So getting governments to invest as they used to, and getting government to regulate access to medicines so that we get what we need for everybody. That's critical. So shaping these rules on access to medicines is not just the vaccine, it's therapeutics, it is diagnostics, it's all of that, and it's changing the rules for the future so that both HIV and other diseases have what we need for it. So that's one. Two, but bearing in mind that the urgency now is the vaccine. The second thing is financing. Really, in the middle of this crisis, we must push hard for particularly the developing countries to have the resources they need to fight and survive in this crisis. We've got to have many of the countries in Africa, especially low-income countries that are highly indebted, to have that debt cancelled, restructured, to give them space to fight. They're talking now, actually they have already shared what they call special drawing rights. This is an instrument that is used to increase money globally. But these special drawing rights are going more to the rich countries than to the poor countries. That is, we need to pressure the rich countries to share some of their SDRs so that developing countries have the space to fight. And we have to fight for this aid. to be maintained. This country has been a leader, but has cut from 0.7 to 0.5. We must push this country, encourage the government to get back to where it was. Fortunately, others are not cutting right now. There's no reason to think they won't. We need to keep the pressure on for global solidarity through aid. Financing, critical. Within that also, to put money onto support to manufacture in the developing world, to manufacture medicines. So that is critical. So that's the second point. The third one is, oh, by the way, also on this question of access to medicines, let us not forget to ride on this technology that has come up, the mRNA. That could also have solutions for HIV. We know, for example, that some money is being put into researching to see whether the Moderna technology for their vaccine, Moderna, can also produce a vaccine for HIV. We have to insist on innovations to end AIDS as well, to get a vaccine or a cure for it. So that is important. The third one is the rights agenda. Because as we've seen again, COVID has shown it. If it wasn't clear through HIV, we always knew it, that it is those other factors, social inequalities, economic inequalities that make certain people more vulnerable to pandemics. Look, even here in this country, you saw that the deaths were high, or the infection rates amongst Black people, Asian people. We saw that in America. We see it in many countries that the low-income people, women, elderly people because they are weaker physically, but also because often they live in poverty. So these social, economic factors that lead to unequal health outcomes have to be addressed. And this has to do with rights, people enjoying equal rights as citizens in our country. So fighting more on decriminalization and human rights of people who are not counted and not given the same access to public services. This is a key agenda for us. To me, those are the big ones that we must act on and act on with urgency. And we have a movement that can do that, that has proven itself.
It's true.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry. I think we have unfortunately run out of time. There were a lot of interesting questions. There were questions around whether we need to apply, we need to think about, is it about inequality or dealing with equality or with inequity? I think there's interesting thoughts there. There were also lots of questions around the role of UNAIDS in terms of coordinating a COVID response. I promise all of our participants, we will take those questions and we will bring them back to Winnie and to UNAIDS. I think interestingly from two parts of the world, one from Latin America, where the question is, where's Latin America in all of this? And where is the attention by UNAIDS in terms of HIV in Latin America, but also obviously COVID? And a really interesting, two interesting points I want to mention before I hand over to Anne to close. A question from Senegal around the decline in political leadership and saying that, and me and Winnie have often had those conversations. We know what we need to do, but we often lack the political leadership and will to do them. And I think there is a reflection from Senegal that they feel that the HIV agenda is missing or is losing that political space in some countries. And lastly, there was one interesting question, I think, by our colleagues from AVERD, by Sarah Hand from AVERD, to ask, what are the lessons that haven't been learned from HIV that could be beneficial to COVID? And have we even looked into that? Are there things we have actually achieved and that we haven't talked about? And there's some stuff that might be very technical, but I also sometimes think it's about the political maneuvering and the tactics. We all talk about it at a level where we don't really ask ourselves, how did we get to the achievements that we got to? That was about tactics very often. It wasn't about the right information in front of people. Anyway, unfortunately, we don't have all the time to discuss this, but we will come back to you. Lois has made a very clear call on all of us that we will come back to this conversation, because as I said at the beginning, the time is now and it's urgent, and we can't waste any time to make to get to a different stage in terms of how we bring the HIV movement to those questions. But because we've run out of time, I will hand over to Anne to just close us off.
Great, thank you, Chrissy. So yeah, an awful lot to digest, an awful lot of learning that we do already have from the AIDS epidemic, including, giving a human face to a disease for arguably the most stigmatized disease in the world. The inequalities lens that the UNAIDS strategy has, I think is absolutely appropriate, because we're facing an existential crisis here. We're facing the idea that COVID and the pandemics we've already been fighting for decades, and the pandemics to come, unless we understand that we provide treatment for everybody, as you've said, unless we have access to health technologies and to vaccines and to money, and unless, as Cindy and Lois were saying, unless we have a seat at the table where those conversations are being had, we will be siloed into an absolute disaster. One of the things I just want to pull out from what we've heard today is and particularly from Cindy and Lois, is the role of communities and the huge challenge that they're facing. Seeing HIV services disappear, governments and donors turning their attention to COVID and future pandemics, and the vulnerability that people living with HIV and the vulnerable populations who live with HIV, who were vulnerable before HIV, have really been so seriously impacted. And it's one of the things that has been apparent in the last 18 months around the world, including right here in the UK, is the role that communities can play in the response. It starts with people. It starts with people who gather and provide help and services to one another, to their neighbors, to their local community. People who see the human face of the pandemic, and to exclude them from the table and not have them informing and staying with a biomedical response to these epidemics is destined to fail. And that you very eloquently brought that out in your opening remarks, Winnie. And I think it's something that we must remember. In June of last year, the Foundation and Frontline AIDS, of this year, as Chrissy said, we wrote to the Prime Minister ahead of the UK, ahead of the G7 summit, and we made this point that if we start from scratch, if we push everything aside of what we've already done, and we start all over again, we will waste precious time, we will waste precious money, and the risk is we will make all the same mistakes again. I think what Lois said is also very, very relevant, this idea that we have learned so much. And an awful lot of the AIDS response, there wasn't a precedent for. There wasn't a precedent for this extraordinarily stigmatized disease that spread along, as you say, the fault lines of where people are vulnerable. And we have learned so much about it. Now it seems that the HIV community is being asked to break new ground and show the rest of the development community, this is how we must work together. We cannot be siloed into our own specific diseases or our own specific objectives. We have to all work together on this. There's a wonderful, I think it's a Hebrew saying, which is, if I am not for myself, then who will be for me? We all have to stand up for ourselves. We have to make our case. We have to share the data. We have to, as Cindy said, we have to speak truth to power. But the second part of the proverb is, if I am for myself only, then who am I? And if we keep being for ourselves only, whether it's just HIV, whether it's just rich countries, we will just face waves and waves and waves of this. So thank you, everybody, for your wonderful contributions. An awful lot to think about. As Chrissy says, we will be coming back with more challenges for you to engage in the People's Vaccine and other initiatives. And thank you so much to our three panelists. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and much more to come. And please, we need to keep this on the agenda. This is our future. This is everybody's future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.